Chapter 15 of Lucky Lure at Arrow Point by Mary Daem. This chapter takes place in a storm, so I thought for some realistic sound effects we'd listen to it outside today. Chapter 15. Jamie tiptoed into the kitchen. He put on his rubber boots and his red sweater and a coat and a cap and a woolen scarf. He coaxed a little dog from under the stove. Packing up the storm lantern, he opened the front door and slipped outside with Minty. The wind nearly tore the doorknob from his hand, but Jamie hung on tightly and shut it firmly behind him. Outside it was terribly dark. The rain blew into his face and stung his eyes. He counted the steps as he stumbled down them, and he fought his way to the gate and turned left towards the wharf. He could hear the waves above the roar of the wind. They made so much noise that he almost turned around and ran for the house. But Mr. Craig was his friend, and he needed his help. He forced himself to go on. Twice he strayed off the roadway, but the bushes stopped him and gave him direction. He fell hard, but he hung on to the lantern and struggled up again. On the wharf at last, the wind was even worse. The boards were wet and slippery, and Jamie was in very real danger of falling off into the lake. He almost crawled, and the wind buffeted the breath from him. His free hand touched the walls of the shed, and he pushed himself inside and collapsed into the old rocking chair. Minty crawled between the rockers and whined in sympathy with Jamie's sobbing. Jamie was so wet and so tired and so miserable. It would be nice just to shut his eyes and go to sleep in Grandma's rocker until the wind stopped blowing and it was light again. Jamie nearly did just that, but he looked at the lantern, still clamped between his fingers, and slowly he raised himself from the rocker. He found the big nail near the open doorway, and he stretched himself up on the tips of his toes and hung the lantern there. He gave a little sigh of accomplishment, and now without the lantern the darkness closed in. Step by step he worked his way to the end of the wharf, and made his way slowly back to the little house with the red roof, to the little house with the light in the window, and to a grandmother who didn't even know he had gone. And he didn't care one single bit if he was crying, because no one could hear him anyway, and his leg hurt and there was a blister on his heel. He almost frightened his grandmother out of her wits as he sloshed into her clean kitchen, Minty trailing behind him. "I put the light up high," he told her, and sat himself down wetly on the kitchen floor. Next thing he knew, it was morning, and he'd had a horrible dream, a dream of rain and wind and somebody lost. Only, well, it wasn't a dream. Jamie rubbed his eyes. He sat up in bed and he sneezed. He sneezed so hard that Minty scurried from under the bed and began to bark, and Mrs. Turner hurried in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her white apron. "Is that you sneezing, Jamie?" "I think so. Sounds like it." Another sneeze got started and wouldn't stop. "Hot milk for you, and you'll stay in bed, please." Jamie didn't feel like arguing. His nose tickled and he was strangely tired. But there was something he had to know. "Grandma, did Mr. Craig find my light?" "Indeed he did, not a moment too soon. He'll be along later to thank you. It was a wonderful thing you did last night." "But Jamie, tell me, weren't you afraid?" Jamie's eyes opened as wide as he could get them. He pulled the red and white quilt up around his knees. He looked very small. "Grandma," he confided, "I was just so scared that I won't ever be scared again, honest." Mrs. Turner wiped her eyes with one corner of her apron. "Jamie," she said, "listen to me. You were a foolish boy to go out in the dark like that and without telling me, and I ought to be scolding you hard. But you made yourself go when you were afraid, and that's a brave thing in itself. Mr. Craig believes you saved his life, and I do too. Oh, it's proud they'll be when I tell them this." "Who's them, Grandma?" Jamie sneezed another tremendous sneeze. "Why, your father and mother. Who else? Now I'll be bringing your breakfast, and you're to eat it up, every last crumb. I'll bet my father doesn't think I could go out in the dark alone like that, does he, Grandma?" "I'll bet he doesn't," Mrs. Turner agreed, "but he'll soon find out." And she bustled into the kitchen and shook up the fire. Jamie wrinkled his forehead and puzzled over his grandmother's remark. "Grandma," he called, and was just going to ask her what she meant, when Mr. Craig came knocking at the door, and Jamie forgot all about it. That's the end of chapter 15.